I will be painting on Arch's 140-pound watercolor paper, cold press. The first step is to mask out the orchid. Since for this painting I plan to do the background first. So using my masking fluid, Pabio drawing gum, poured some in this little container, and I'm going to flow it. For a complete list of supplies, please see the description below. Covering the orchid with masking fluid will protect the orchid from the darker colors that I'm going to apply in the background. The watercolor background will seamlessly blend and flow around the foreground orchid, creating a harmonious and organic composition. I'm making sure I don't have any little white gaps, bare gaps where the paper's showing through. That would be annoying. The description below contains a link to the painting's reference photo and drawing that can be downloaded. Okay, I have the whole thing covered, and I did notice some little white areas. While it's still wet, I touch them with my brush, fill them in. Important to keep your brush clean. Never use a good brush. Use a brush that is relatively inexpensive. And what I do is I put a little Windex and a little soapy water in a bottle like this. I drilled a hole in the lid that accommodates my brush, and there we go. Very easy way of keeping the brush clean. Masking fluid will eventually destroy any brush you use, so please don't use a good paintbrush. Use one that you don't care too much about. Anyway, time to let this set up. It has to be 100% dry before I can begin painting, so that may take an hour or so. It's been a few hours and the masking is totally dry, so I'm good to paint. But before I begin to paint, I'm going to just do one more thing. Since I have this paper stretched and it's taped down with gummed packaging tape, the only way to remove this is to cut this when I'm finished and then tear it along the edge of the tape so I get a nice clean deckled edge. But I'm going to lose any potential for a white border, so what I would like to do is come in just a little bit more. I don't have to come in a ½ inch. I just want a little bit of a white border around the watercolor. So that's about 1/4 of an inch. This is 2-inch masking tape. I'll tape it along that border. There's an added advantage, aside from the tape creating a white border around the watercolor. What it does is it acts as an additional barrier, preventing water from getting into the paper tape underneath that's glued down. I'm about to begin the painting, and the first step is to wet the paper thoroughly using my 1½ inch brush. So with clean water, brush across the entire thing. Now you can see the tremendous advantage of using masking to protect the flower area. I'll begin laying in the background with Winsor Yellow, the lightest color that I see. Then I'll work the other colors into that. I see lighter value colors throughout this area that I'm applying the Winsor Yellow. I'm going to quickly go into some of my mixed greens. This is a combination of ultramarine blue and Winsor Yellow. And I see a lighter green in this area. I'm using cobalt blue and Winsor Yellow. I'm going to pick up some of that down here too. On this side, things tend to get darker. So this is where I'm going to flow in a wash of neutral tint as my foundation color. Notice I'm not blending with my brush. I'm applying the color, but I'm letting it do its own thing. It's going to bleed on its own. Now I'd like to go in to a little burnt sienna in this area right here. Come down a little burnt sienna in here. I see stems and things in the background. There's a strong line of burnt sienna going up like that on an angle. It's a nice counterbalance to what's going on here. Little brown matter. See brown matter poking through down here. And I would also like to get a little bit of Antwerp blue in this area. I'm referring to the photo for color information and for suggestions of patterns of light and dark. I'm not attempting to realistically reproduce what I see in the background. Now I'm applying sap green to areas throughout the painting wherever I see stronger hints of green. The sap green that is freely mixing with the wet colors that are already on the paper is resulting in some nice foliage colors. Even though you see me dragging the sap green onto the paper with my brush, I'm not brushing it and blending it into the wet paint that's already down. I'm just dropping it and leaving it where it is. Using my large brush, I'd like to, with this twirling action, lift some of these colors out of this area. There's a lot of highlights down here that actually bleed out to white in the photograph. Compositionally, they would be a very nice element to include. I'm pressing a number 10 mop brush into the wet paint, and this will absorb paint from the surface. I'm noticing a big pool of water that's collected in the upper right hand corner of the painting. So what I'm going to do is lift up the board and rotate the paper, watercolor paper, around to spread that pool of water into the surrounding area and allow some of it to run off the paper. There's a little bit of that aureolin yellow. Just want to get some little splatters of that. Some linear hints of Winsor yellow. Notice I not only press the mop brush into the surface of the paper, but I also use a twisting motion. Gonna let it dry. Not gonna do anything else. I don't want to run the risk of overworking the area. It's been a full 24 hours since I applied the masking and painted in the background, and now it's completely dry. It's safe for me to remove the masking. How do we remove the masking? With a rubber cement pickup. And the way I do it is I gently rub into the surface. I don't press too hard. Can also grab onto the masking. Sometimes this works, sometimes it doesn't. If you are able to remove the masking this way, this is even more preferable than rubbing it. There's less of an opportunity to damage the paper by just pulling it off like this. Beautiful. Next step is to develop the petals and analyzing the photograph of this beautiful orchid. I'll start painting the lightest colored petals first and then gradually work to paint in the darker center petal and eventually the leaves. To begin painting, I'm going to restrict my palette to just 3 colors. I'm going to start with quinacridone magenta, cobalt blue. I'm throwing in a little bit more quinacridone magenta just to see how it mixes with the cobalt blue that I just applied. Ultramarine blue. Those are going to be the 3 basic colors that I start with, and I'll be using very light tints of those colors to create the light petals. The first thing I'll do is dampen with clean water the petals. The reason why I dampen the petals first is to prevent brush strokes. What'll happen is if I don't pre-dampen the petals, and these are fairly large areas to paint, so I could get some drying out of paint if I went directly in with the paint. But by pre-dampening it, the paint doesn't settle into the paper too quickly. The moisture offers a little resistance, so the paint more or less floats on the surface. I'm able to minimize brush stroke, and that's how I like to paint. I like my colors to blend evenly into one another without visible brush strokes. But I'm dampening all of the light petals because I will paint them in as one general wash. Then, when that wash dries, I'll individualize the petals by concentrating on them one at a time to work in shadows and highlights. Now, what I'm going to do is give it the lightest wash of quinacridone magenta, just to indicate this general violet tone that permeates all of the lighter petals. The first washes of my watercolor painting are always transparent colors. I'll save opaque colors for later on when I'm finishing up the painting. Now, even though this is a very light value, what I would like to do is lift some of it out to create even a lighter area. This almost turns into the white of the paper. Not quite, but gets close. With the heel of my brush, I press the damp brush into the surface and lift out color. Also notice how I move the brush in an angular arc across the surface. The petals are very light, so the color applications are going to be very subtle. I'll use a hairdryer to speed up the drying process, but I only use the hairdryer when the water shine of the paper is gone and the paper has a matte look. To do so sooner would halt the natural look of the watercolor surface because it would too rapidly dry the watercolor. If it wasn't completely dry for the next stage, and I introduced paint into the area, wet paint into what was potentially wet underpainting, I would get backruns, and I want to avoid a backrun at this stage. Now I'm beginning to wash in some of the darker shadow areas using cobalt blue. The cobalt blue is being applied over the previous wash of quinacridone magenta. The way I develop light petals is with subsequent layers of color applied as thin washes and allowed to dry. Shadow is pretty deep there in the top part, so I'm going to work in with my ultramarine blue. But as soon as I lay that wash in, I'm going to drag it with clean water. It gets shadowy over here in the front part of the petal. Thinking I might want to create a little back run right over here to indicate some of the texture I see on the petal. So we'll see what happens with those water droplets that I just introduced. The back run would be subtle. Since the paper is relatively damp in this area, it's a good time to paint in the central line of the petal using quinacridone magenta. But I'd like to get a little bit more of the magenta color in here. I just applied the magenta color over the wash of ultramarine blue, so it's allowing me to get a darker value towards the center and towards the edge of the flower where the petal begins to curve, picks up some shadows. Building richness and texture into a whitish flower, you have to proceed slowly with subtle color applications and pay careful attention to the patterns of light and dark. Beautiful transition to a very pale magenta down here. Now I'm applying ultramarine blue to the very tip of the petal to indicate its curvature. And I'm bringing it up along the side of the petal. The introduction of ultramarine blue as a shadow wash introduces a curvature, a feeling of curvature to the surface of the petal. Now what I like to do is leave it alone. I don't like to, as I mentioned before, speed up the drying with a hairdryer. I like to leave it alone and let it dry on its own. As it's drying, I study the surface very carefully to see when I lose a lot of that shine, because I find introducing little tiny natural back runs into the surface enhance the look of the petal and give it a more natural feel. And I'm starting to see that as a possibility over here. So with a little bit of clean water on my brush, damp brush, hit it in the stick, a little bit of water flies off, hits the surface of my petal. I like to create situations that emphasize the accidental things that occur that result in beautiful watercolored surfaces. I jumped down to this lower petal to introduce washes of cobalt blue in an effort to indicate that the petal is curving into the central part of the flower. And I'm also going to carry the wash over to towards the tip of the petal to indicate curvature. To start the center petal of the orchid, I'm going to begin with this very bright red yellow area in here. So the first thing I do is flow water into this center area to prepare it for the paint that I'm about to apply. To begin the center area, I'm going to start with a wash of aureolin yellow. After applying the aureolin yellow, I'm going to work in some Winsor red. And it's not going to be a very fluid wash of red. It's a fairly dry red, enough to hold its own shape. There we go. I'm applying the red thick enough so it doesn't totally flow into the wet aureolin yellow. It sort of holds its linear shape. But in addition to the Winsor red, I'd also like to get a little cadmium scarlet in there. Cadmium scarlet is a beautifully strong orangey red. I think it's perfect for this area. Now I'm working in a little bit more of the aureolin yellow in such a way that I'm pushing the red around with the yellow. I'm applying the aureolin yellow more thickly to suggest linear elements that I see coming out of the center part of the flower. It's very important that I leave this area dry because I don't want this shape flowing into this shape. I'm going to stop working on this center area for a while and move on to another section of the flower. I'm going to dampen this area. I even see hints of cerulean in this area, and that might be a nice touch. Mix a little of that cerulean with water, loosen it up. I don't want a lot, I just want a hint. Now I'm flowing in quinacridone magenta into the wet area where I just applied the cerulean blue. And with a cleaned, dampened brush, I work back in to lift color out. Then I continue to add a slightly thicker application of quinacridone magenta to start adding in detail. And because the paper in this area is damp, the lines that I'm adding I'm going to blur to a nice soft focus. Since this area is still damp, I decided to drop some more aureolin yellow into the reddish area. The aureolin yellow is effectively pushing the red around to create these linear elements. It's time to develop some of the leaves. And I've already pre-dampened this area, and to start the leaf I'm going to lay in a foundation wash of burnt sienna. I've also splattered in a little bit of yellow ochre into this area. And since everything is very wet, I'm going to lift out a little bit of the moisture and color with my dampened brush. And into that, I'm going to begin to add my pre-mixed greens, which are cobalt blue and Winsor yellow, and Winsor yellow and ultramarine blue. Now I'm applying my mixture of cobalt blue and Winsor yellow into the still wet application of burnt sienna. Now I'm dropping in aureolin yellow into the mixed greens that I just applied. I'm still painting wet into wet, and now to bring out some of the shadowy areas in the leaf, I'm applying my mixture of Winsor yellow and ultramarine blue. It's a darker mixture than the previously added mixtures. And I apply the paint in a linear fashion to suggest the detail that I see on the surface of the leaf. A bit of sap green will punch up the color nicely. The watercolor washes in this area have dried completely, so I was able to pre-dampen the area with clean water, and now I'm applying in quinacridone magenta. But I'll fade out the magenta color as I approach the area that I want to leave white, that's closest to the yellow and red part of the center of the flower. In the center of the petal, the magenta turns to white before transitioning to yellow and then cadmium scarlet. I always apply my transparent colors first to the white of the paper or glaze into them with additional transparents and save the opaques for the finishing stages of detail development. Reversing the process would result in dull colors with diminished luminosity. While the magenta is wet, I'll lift out color to suggest detail along the edge of the petal. A clean, damp brush is very effective for lifting out color that is beginning to dry. Now I'm continuing to develop this area of the leaves by applying applications of sap green along with mixtures of mixed greens that are combinations of Winsor yellow with ultramarine blue and Winsor yellow with cobalt blue. And into these mixed greens I'm dropping in yellow ochre. Having done one half of the primary petal, now I can continue with this side. This is thoroughly dry over here, and I need that to be dry because I want a distinction between the halves of this petal. Before I apply the paint, I'll pre-dampen the area with clean water. Next I apply aureolin yellow to the edge of the dampened area. And with clean water I soften and blend the aureolin yellow into the whitish area. Next, I'm going to work in cadmium scarlet, and I'm painting the cadmium scarlet in right along the edge line. I've carefully redampened the area of the petal, and now I'm working some magenta back into the edge to establish some more detail. But I keep my brushing to a minimum so as not to reactivate the paint underneath. But this is how I achieve my little fold overs. For example, that's occurring over there. Well, originally that was the first color that I laid down, the light washer magenta. But now that I've dampened around it, left that part dry, I'm able to add more color, and it automatically darkens this area and allows that to stand out as a fold in the leaf. I'm gonna lay in my pure quinacridone magenta. The yellow area is completely dry, but what I did before I began painting in the quinacridone magenta is I redampened that area into the white area. This way the magenta is now going to gradually fade to white and then yellow. And we go to relatively light color down here. This time I'm going to end it right here. I'm not going to carry over with the fold over. I could have, but I want to get a stronger line right over here. It's time to start painting the bottom left-hand leaf. There's a lot of yellow ochre in this leaf. So what I'm going to do is get some of my yellow pre-mixed ochre with water. Make sure it's the right amount of water to paint, and it is. It's good. I'll use the number 6 Skoda. Dampen the paper. So with the paper pre-dampened, I'll flow in some yellow ochre as my foundation color. Beautiful color. Notice this area is considerably darker than that area, and that might be too, which is what I don't want. When you have something that acts as a barrier between surfaces, you have to make sure what's on one side is on the other side in terms of color and lightness. So what I'm going to do is lighten it up a little bit, maybe just pick some paint up from there and move it over to here. That's what I mean by the continuity of the background. This becomes the background for this right now. It flows behind it as a background. So it wouldn't make sense to have an abrupt color change from section to section. And I pay attention to detail. I see how I don't want little white gaps over there. I want this to come right up against the flower. That's looking fairly good. I'm going to let it set up for a bit, and then I'm going to work in some shades of green because the leaves have these, see them, how they come down? And to suggest them, I think I'm going to mix a little ultramarine blue with Winsor yellow. So I carry that over. I follow that rule of the continuity of the background. Now a little bit over here. But I don't blend with some kind of brushing action. I allow the color to just sit there and blend on its own. Where you stop your brush stroke, you're going to get a pool of water. See how I have excess water bleeding out there? So just be aware of that. Make sure you stop your brush where you want the darkest area to be. So while that's setting up, I'm going to rotate my board so I can get at the top rather than lean on it and paint into it. This makes it much easier to reach that section. I'm dampening it. To start painting this area, I'm going to begin with a foundation wash of cobalt blue mixed with Winsor yellow.
Right about here, there's a much lighter value coming through the leaf. And I think what it is sunlight from the background. And there's a shadow in this area. Shadow is because this petal is blocking the light from getting through this area of the leaf. But I'll have to do that later. Right now, I'm going to simply take a little of my cadmium yellow, because I see the color's a little bit warmer there, and float that in. Leave it alone. Let it do its thing. I can also indicate the stem over here, which is quite dark, but it has a bit of a highlight on top. So I'm going to start with the highlight. I have some leftover paint on my brush. I'll lay that in with my brush. Now I'm going to drop down with cobalt blue and Winsor yellow and just touch the bottom of that and let it bleed up. With a clean dampened brush, I lift out the highlight. No need to pre-dampen a little tiny area like this. I'm just going to flow in a mixture of my quinacridone magenta with a little bit of cobalt blue added to it. Come down to the tip of it, moving away from the overlap area. I'm lifting some of that out to suggest a transition from a darker shade to a lighter color. While that was still damp, I wanted to apply a little bit of the ultramarine blue with Winsor yellow to indicate a darker color over there and a darker shade of green down here. This actually seems to be where the leaf curls up upon itself.
I've rotated the painting so I could comfortably paint in this area.
This is ultramarine blue with Winsor yellow. Now I'd like to lighten this area. And I'll float in some cadmium yellow right at the top. Yeah, that looks good. I like what's happening there. With a very fine liner brush dipped in a bit of burnt sienna, I'm going to suggest this center line.
This area is still damp, so after I apply the burnt sienna to suggest the center line, the line will gradually soften. The painting is almost finished, but I plan to continue to work into it with transparent glazes to further define and enhance areas that I see as still unresolved.
I'm going to take a little bit of my pre-mixed combination of Winsor yellow and ultramarine blue, and I'm going to lay in this little overlap area.
This is the stage where I can safely add my opaques on top of the transparent washes underneath.
Into that, I'm just going to apply a little bit of cadmium yellow.
This side also has a curled up part of the leaf. Now I'm painting the shape of that overlapping part of the leaf with my mixture of ultramarine blue and Winsor yellow. And I added a little bit of cadmium yellow into that wet application of paint, so it lightens the green area.
Now that area makes sense. I do have the shadow that I would like to work in over here, and this becomes my lighter value, but I need to leave that alone right now and let it dry before I can touch that.
Time to darken this area a bit to suggest that the leaf curls over upon itself. I'm introducing a graded wash of quinacridone magenta to a dampened section of the petal, and I'm allowing it to fade out as a graded wash at the top part of the petal.
So now I have better transition from highlight to shadow area.
Next, I'm going to apply a very light wash of cobalt blue to this large leaf to push it into shadow a bit more. There we go, a very light wash of cobalt blue in this area to make it more of a shadow area and allow the orchid to pop out in the foreground.
I can further enrich this part of the petal.
The first step is to re-dampen the area using a minimal amount of brush strokes because I don't want to activate the paint underneath. With the surface redampened, I'm now working in some of the subtle details that I see to enrich the surface using a light wash of the original quinacridone magenta color. At this stage, I could spend many more hours enhancing the detail work if I chose to do so. At this stage of development, I'm going to continue to work throughout the entire surface of the orchid to further develop the shadow areas. That's what the painter needs. And to do this, I'm going to use light washes of cobalt blue and ultramarine blue. With ultramarine blue on my paintbrush, I'm going to flow in the shadow area on this leaf. The type of work that I've begun to do here by enriching the surface with more delicate veils of color can go on and on for hours, and you can continue to enrich and develop detail. The painting process is finished. I hope you enjoyed watching my method for painting the Cattleya Orchid in watercolor.